So how does the dwarfism community actually feel about Disney's Snow White remake and the new depictions of the seven dwarf characters being CGI magical creatures? This film has caused so much outrage over the last few years, and in 2022, Peter Dinklage gave his 2 cents on these characters and the movie in general, which caused even more controversy. There are so many think pieces on the internet, viral videos about these seven dwarf characters, but rarely do we actually see little people involved in these conversations. I see a lot of non-disabled people voicing opinions on the film, opinions on the seven dwarf characters, and claiming that the little people community is outraged and the little people community this. It's time, I think, to talk about how actual little people feel about this. I figured this would be a great topic to talk about on my YouTube channel, and if you're new here, hi, my name's Aubrey Smalls, and I'm a historian and filmmaker with dwarfism. Today I'm going to be covering Disney's upcoming live-action remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. As of filming this video, it is January 2025, and the movie comes out in March, which means that the press cycle for this movie is about to begin. So I wanted to get ahead of the impending controversies that are going to come out when it comes to the seven dwarf characters. In this video, we're going to be going over the film in general, we're going to be going over the production timeline, Peter Dinklage's comments, the controversy surrounding the seven dwarf characters, as well as adaptations of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that I think did a good job at representation of the dwarfism community, and what I would have done as a filmmaker and an actor when it comes to Disney's remake. So without further ado, let's just dive right into this. And before I start this video, let this be known that this is not an opportunity to bash Rachel Zegler for her involvement in the film. She has nothing to do with the topics that we're discussing, and I will not be tolerating any misogyny or racism spread her way. So on October 31st, 2016, it was announced that Disney was moving ahead with a live-action version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that was going to be written by Aaron Wilson. In 2019, Mark Webb signed on to direct the film, and in 2021, Greta Gerwig came on board to co-write the script with Aaron Wilson. Between June 2021 and February 2022, casting took place with Rachel Zegler joining the cast as Snow White, Gal Gadot as the evil queen, and Andrew Burnap as a new Prince Charming-esque character. Now, this is important to note, at this point, Disney had only referred to this movie as Snow White, which is kind of odd for Disney, who cares a lot about branding and IP, to not name it Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And personally, all the way back when this movie was announced, this was my first indication as a little person that they were probably not going to do the traditional seven dwarf characters, because why not just call it Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? And during the casting process, they never mentioned the Seven Dwarfs at all, which I found very odd considering that these are big characters in the film, right? These aren't just throwaway extra characters. They play a huge role in the film, and if they were casting little people at all during this process, we would have heard about these little people being cast. Bum 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 bum! Now, in 2022, actor Peter Dinklage went on to Mark Maron's podcast, and during the podcast, they briefly talked about the remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, since it was right about to start filming at this point. Now, I want to read to you exactly what Peter Dinklage said, just because his comments have been so far misconstrued and taken out of context that I think it's really important to pay attention to the actual words that he said. There's a lot of hypocrisy going on. Literally no offense to anyone, but I was a little taken aback when they were very proud to cast a Latina actress as Snow White, but you're still telling the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Take a step back and look at what you're doing there. It makes no sense to me. You're progressive in one way, but then you're still making that backward story about seven dwarves living in a cave together. What are you doing, man? Have I done nothing to advance the cause for my soapbox? I guess I'm not loud enough. I don't know which studio that is, but they were so proud of it. All love and respect to the actress and all of the people who thought they were doing the right thing. But I'm just like, what are you doing? So I think there's several different things to point out. One, so many people that I see get caught up on the words, oh, you're making a movie about seven guys who live in a cave, and people are like, that's not the story, that's not... Focus, guys. Focus. He was commenting on a valid aspect of the movie. It is a little strange that we have a film or a story about seven men who live in a forest by themselves in a house with no explanation for how they know each other or where they came from, and then a teenage girl comes to randomly live with them. It is weird. Second, it is true that Disney did a whole PR cycle about how proud they were to cast a person of color as Snow White and how they were taking a more progressive approach to the film. Now, a lot of y'all are going to get mad at me when I say this, but I have nothing against people of color playing these roles. I think Rachel is a talented and qualified actress, and everyone always talks about how it should be the right person and the most talented person for the job, yet when it's a person of color, suddenly it's everyone's trying to be woke, everyone's trying to be... It's a movie about a talking mirror that tells a queen that she's pretty or not. And a girl that can talk to animals. I really just don't find anybody's critiques of the color of her skin to be valid. There's literally no... It's a remake, especially. You already have the traditional Snow White. You have lots of adaptations of Snow White. It's just not that big of a deal that a role was given to a person of color. I'm not even buying the whole, well, she's called Snow White because the color of her skin... Do you see how that line even in itself in the story is kind of stupid? Because no one's skin is the color of snow. Even Caucasian people, their skin tone doesn't match the color of snow to begin with. So it's a very weird thing to get hung up on. But yes, it is true that Disney paraded themselves around for being progressive in that regard. And what Peter was saying was that how can you be progressive for people of color, but when it comes to disabled people, you're still giving them roles that are one-dimensional, that have no depth. These are real characters that should be fully developed. And traditionally in the story, the Seven Dwarf characters are definitely props. They're not really supposed to be fully realized characters, but in 2025, obviously we see that people with disabilities are not props and should be given fully realized characters. And we'll talk a little bit about later on in the video versions of the story that did the characters right and gave them fully fleshed out, fully realized backstories and personalities, but just reducing these characters as dwarfs that are sleepy, grumpy, stupid, farty, like whatever they're called, isn't the move. But it's not that progressive at the end of the day if we're only being progressive in one avenue when it comes to marginalized groups. To be progressive is to see the humanity in all minority group and marginalized groups and not just picking and choosing. And what Peter was saying is, as someone who has done the degrading roles, who has done the one-dimensional roles where he's the dwarf character and had to stop working in the industry for years because he refused to accept those jobs, he was saying, have I not done enough speaking out and taking on better roles and being a better representation of the dwarfism community? How do we have the largest studio in the world still reducing the community to these base level roles and not giving them any other opportunity in any of the hundreds and hundreds of projects that Disney pumps out every year, from their TV shows to their theme parks to their films to all of the divisions that they own? Like, think of it, Disney owns Star Wars, Marvel, Disney live action, they have Pixar. There's hundreds of opportunities to cast little people, whether as voice actors or in live action roles, and they just refuse to do it. But here comes Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. So I honestly totally got his comments. I remember hearing the podcast and being like, I'm not even a ride or die Peter Dinklage fan at all. I didn't even watch Game of Thrones. My version of Peter Dinklage in my brain is him in Elf, which is not a flattering look. But I remember hearing that and being like, well, duh, I don't see the big problem. Why are people offended? But oh, people got mad. So mad that the next day, Disney had to release a statement because it was picking up in the news Peter Dinklage's comments, and it was already being spun in a dwarfism community slams Disney. And mind you, this was at a time when Disney was there were a lot of legal troubles with like Ron DeSantis. The whole Disney hate train was in full effect at this time. So it was very easy for these big publications in the media to jump on any criticism of Disney, which is really what this was. They were using a disabled man's plea for better representation of his community as an avenue to bash a billion-dollar corporation. That was all that was going on there. And the fact that people just gobble, ate it right up is just still to this day astounding to me that they bought into that propaganda. But nevertheless, the media picked up the story and overnight it became a viral sensation. Peter Dinklage slams Snow White. So Disney the next day released a statement saying that they had been working with members of the dwarfism community to avoid any stereotypes of little people, and they were going in a different direction and portraying these characters as magical creatures instead of seven dwarfs. Now mind you, this is all started just a month before they started filming the movie, so sets were already being built, casting and production was complete. People were flying out to London where it was being shot to get ready for the production to start. So this had been years in the making already, and there's this big misconception that Peter Dinklage's comments in January got 7 little people fired, even though there's no evidence to suggest that, and that the magical creatures that they referenced in that statement were them backtracking because of Peter Dinklage's comments. To go from 7 human live-action actors to 7 CGI characters would take a complete overhaul of production. So much goes into motion capture and CGI performances. It is a completely different filming process having 7 characters with dwarfism portrayed by motion capture and CGI than it is with live action performances. So there's just no way realistically that could have been changed overnight in such a small time period. But nevertheless, filming began in March of 2022 for a few months, but a year later, in the summer of 2023, they did some reshoots, which is basically when they're editing the film and they go, okay, we need some more shots of this and shots of that. It's not redoing the film in most cases. Some films have historically redone a lot of the film during reshoots because they're editing it and they're like, oh crap, this is garbage. These reshoot photos caused a lot of fire online and controversy because they depicted a stand-in for Snow White, a stand-in for the Prince Charming character. The photos also featured a troupe of 7 people, one of which had dwarfism, which made the internet assume that these were the new 7 dwarf characters. And the people got so mad all over again, claiming that Peter Dinklage took away the jobs of 6 actors with dwarfism and only 1 little person got the job. And Disney had to come out later and clarify that these were simply reshoots, these didn't feature all of the actors in the film, and that they were stand-ins for Snow White, the prince, and that these were 7 new characters that they had added to the film that were not the 7 dwarf characters. In October of 2023, Disney announced that the film was being delayed until 2025, and as a part of this announcement, they released a first official look of the film, which involved Snow White and the 7 dwarf characters. And in this version, they were all CGI. And this was the first time that they had even acknowledged these new characters and released something official regarding them. And this caused another round of controversy because not only do they look interesting, they were clearly not the reshoot photos of those 7 bandits that people previously had assumed were the new 7 dwarves, and they were not little people, they were CGI characters. Over the next year, the teaser trailer and trailers came out for the film, showing us what these characters actually looked like in motion, and they're, I'm gonna be honest, not great. I don't want to disrespect the artists that had nothing to do with the design of these characters, but they don't look great. They look like odd depictions of dwarfism. These are definitely not magical creatures, they're just people with dwarfism, but called something different. People are smarter than that. It's very evident that these are supposed to be little people adjacent. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too, but not call it the 7 dwarves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, are these characters inherently offensive? Did they make the right move to not include people with dwarfism and reimagine them as they said? And I wanted to use a few examples of previous adaptations of Snow White and the 7 dwarves that I think had done it right. Starting with Fairy Tale Theater's Snow White, which came out in 1983. I grew up watching Fairy Tale Theater on our VHS machine with me and my siblings. I remember loving this version because they really treated these little people in the film like people. They were heartwarming, they were comedic, and they were just portrayed as being real people. And I think inherently these characters aren't offensive by nature. Dwarfism is the condition that we have, and even though there's some negative connotations with dwarfs in fantasy, these characters don't have to be harmful, dehumanizing depictions of the dwarfism community. And I think that Fairy Tale Theater did a really fantastic job at setting the standard, even back in the 80s, for how these characters could be portrayed. And I highly suggest you watch that. I think it's on YouTube, you can even find it. In 2001, The Fairest of Them All, which was ABC television adaptation of Snow White, came out, and they also, I think, did a pretty good job at depicting these characters in a way that wasn't harmful. They cast 7 actors with dwarfism. I think one of them was an average height person, actually. Six actors with dwarfism. It really developed these characters farther than the original story did, which really had no information on these roles. It was literally just seven dwarves. It was supposed to be like, ooh, you go to a fantasy world and there's dwarves. And I think this ABC special really did a great job. I remember watching it multiple times on TV and thinking that as a little kid who really rarely saw little people on screen, I had no problem with it. I even actually knew one of the little people who played one of the seven dwarves, and they had nothing but positive things to say about the filming experience. So all around, but hands down, the best version is Mirror Mirror, which came out in 2012 and had the actress from Emily in Paris, Lily Collins, starring as Snow White. They took it to the next level. They did exactly what I would have done, which was focus on the writing of these characters and develop them past just being disabled. They gave these characters so many traits that little people have in real life, which is we have to be resourceful because we live in a world that is built for people double our size. So we're really good at things like being handy, we're really smart on our feet, we're quick-witted, we're resourceful, we're innovative, and we don't take disrespect from people just because we have dwarfism. And these characters were, for lack of a better word, badass. They had given them a backstory, they gave them distinct personalities, not just based on simple emotions like sleepy and dopey and grumpy. They gave them well-rounded characters, they gave them a backstory, an explanation for why they were secluded in the woods by themselves and how they knew each other. They even portrayed romance between these characters and non-disabled characters, which you never see in movies. Ever. Name one movie or TV show that represented a romance between a little person and an average height person that was not played for laughs. I will wait. In turn, they taught Snow White how to stand up and fend for herself as well, which I think was a really important plot device because it showed that average height people can also learn from the dwarfism community, and we don't need to be pitied or looked down upon. We can actually learn and gain so much knowledge and life experience from people with dwarfism. And I think this movie did a fantastic job at highlighting the skills and the talents of actors with dwarfism. And many of these actors who played the seven dwarves went on to do amazing things. One of my favorites is Mark Pavanelli, and he went on to go star in a Guillermo del Toro movie that was nominated for an Oscar. He was in Water for Elephants. Like, these are talented actors who were given the opportunity for once to shine. I think there's this misconception that there must not be very many little people in Hollywood or very many talented actors that could fit these parts, and that's why we never see little people, when it's the opposite. There's lots of little people working in Hollywood that have been working in Hollywood since the days of Charlie Chaplin and silent films, but there's just no opportunities being given, and the ones that are elf roles or fantasy roles or cameo roles where the whole purpose is that they have dwarfism. So I think that Mirror Mirror did a great job at transforming what could have been a harmful depiction of dwarfism and turning it into something that was empowering, inspiring, and super memorable. Like, Mirror Mirror is a fan favorite for so many people, and they love the depictions of the little people especially. Like, it just adds a unique element to the film that really no other adaptation has done. They really gave them these warrior, badass energy that Disney really should have done, to be honest. And that leads me to what would I have done if I were consulting for Disney on Snow White, because the people they consulted with, one of them came out and said that the CGI versions were less offensive to her than having little people play these roles. And I will respectfully disagree. I think obviously little people were not a monolith. We all have different views and opinions, and especially depending on the age of the person with dwarfism, might have a totally different relationship with stories like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and Snow White. They grew up with that really just being the only thing people saw them as. Whereas now we obviously see little people as talented and creative individuals that don't need to fall into those stereotypes, but for most generations of people with dwarfism, that wasn't the case. So I can understand why an older little person consulting on a project who doesn't work in Hollywood would give them the advice of going to CGI, but at the same time, I think that especially as a writer myself, I would have really sat down and tried to develop, why do these little people work in a cave in a mine? How do they all know each other? How do they all get to live in the woods by themselves? What led them to do that? And I would delve into things like, who made their house? It was obviously them, so let's show how resourceful and creative and innovative they were. I loved Mirror Mirror for showing all the gadgets and accessibility tools in this fantasy world they had created to survive. and I would have leaned into that 100%. There are so many talented actors in the theater space who have been on Broadway, who are super talented musicians and singers, and I would have picked from that talent pool so you could still have them participating in the musical numbers. And Disney already has attractions in their theme parks centered on the Seven Dwarves, and their roller coasters and like these high energy thrill rides. And I think that creating the Seven Dwarves and reimagining them as these badass heroes would have already played into the brands and IP that they have surrounding these characters. They could have even created a spin-off or a TV series with a backstory of the Seven Dwarves that was like a fantasy action adventure show. And I really think people would have loved that, to be honest. And I think it could have not taken away from this original Snow White story that Disney has, but added on to it in a new way that resonated with more people and opened up the doors not only for 7 actors with dwarfism in the industry, but also just opened up these characters in general, because I think people like them because the design's really cute, they're simple, but I don't really think there's much to connect to when it comes to these characters, and giving them 7 distinct personalities would have opened up the doors for audiences to really connect with these characters and feel like they could see aspects of themselves in them, which in turn would create, more exposure, more money when it comes to marketing and merchandise for Disney. I think that in general, studios oftentimes look to little people who are either outside of the industry or who have a very rigid perspective of dwarfism representation, where they think that we should avoid any of these characters being played by little people, which is why sometimes we get things like Hugh Grant being shrunk down to be an Oompa Loompa, or we get actors who don't have dwarfism voicing the characters of CGI little people, because to some little people that's less offensive. So I think that Disney and other studios just need to be more open to talking to a wider spectrum of people with dwarfism in the industry. There's so many people on TikTok and Instagram who are active members of the industry who also have dwarfism, who I think would have been incredible consultants on the project, me included. And we can't change the past, obviously, but I think it's important to acknowledge that every little person is going to feel differently about these roles on the base level. But what we can do to move the ball forward is to just really delve into the writing of these characters and making sure that they're fully realized humans and being treated as such, even if they're in a fantasy world. Just because you have dwarfism and you're a character in a fantasy world doesn't mean you need to be a different race of human, doesn't mean we need to be doing all that. You can still be a normal person in this world. We just need to make sure that these characters aren't being reduced to being a dwarf, I know so many awesome little people in the industry who I've worked with, who I hope to work with one day in the future, and that I know studios, if they reached out to them, would love working with them as well. I think a lot of studios in general just literally never cast little people, which means they don't even have people with dwarfism on their radar. So when projects like this come up, it's not in their instinct to go, oh, well, I'll just call the little people that we've seen for other projects, because they literally don't know any of them. So I think that's why it's so important that we have more visibility of people with dwarfism in media, so that when projects come along, when casting offices need characters that might have been written in the past as little people, they know where to go. And I also just think in general, we need to stop only calling actors with dwarfism to play these roles. I have nothing against the 7 dwarfs being played by little people, but that should not be the only reason that a casting office calls a little person in. And I think in this case, there was never any little people involved in this process in terms of playing these characters. It was very clear from the beginning that these were always going to be not played by humans and not played by little people. But in general, I just think that we can't be using these opportunities as the only opportunities for little people. We can do better. I need my rom-com with little people. I need like the Willow of the 21st century, the Willow was like 30 years ago at this point almost, in the, 1981 or something, and we have yet to have a lead character in a major motion picture with dwarfism, and Cyrano doesn't count because that was a small indie film that nobody saw, unfortunately. No hate, but I'm just saying, we need to diversify, these roles a lot more so that we don't still have to be talking about Snow White and Oompa Loompas. Like, we're tired. Anyways, I'm curious to know what you guys think. I hope this clears some stuff up. I'm gonna, in the comments down below, link all of the sources for the timeline and the comments that were made by Peter Dinklage so that you can go through them yourselves. So I'll also put some references for the adaptations that I talked about that were great and that I loved and that I thought did a good job at the dwarfism representation. As always, subscribe so you can keep up with these videos. Drop a comment down below. Let me know how you are, or if you have any questions or comments about what I talked about. But I'm Aubrey Smalls. Thank you so much for being here again. I love you. Keep going.